Okay, now I'm basically a writer, so unlike everyone else, I'm going to use notes here. I couldn't memorize everything. I wrote about 5,000 words, which means we've got a lot to get through. So, and I know this is the last talk of the day, so we've all been through a long day, and there's been some amazing presentations. It's all going downhill from now on. All right, let's go. The digitalization of everything we do in our cities is ever deeper, from the way we plan cities and build them, to our everyday personal, social, and street interactions. We are on a bridge between the real world and the digital. We seem to be sleepwalking into an algorithm-driven future. Could that bridge become a disconnect? I'm going to look at psychogeography. It's a concept which is 50 years old now, but it could be a useful term for urbanism. And actually, I've got to say, you know, it's Element Urban Talks. I thought there'd be a bit more urban than there has been sometimes in some of the talks today. But psychogeography could be a useful concept for urbanism, how we make cities and how, as individuals, we interpret and interact with them. And it could give us clues to the future cities we need. Now, my talk will be like a dérive. Dérive is a French word. It's for a drift, drifting along. And it's a key word in the practice of psychogeography. This is a summary of the big dérive that I'm going to take you through. It's a dérive, but it's quite a long walk, and we've got limited time, so it might be a dérive at a fast pace. First of all, I'm going to take you back in time to Paris. There hasn't been very much going back in time. We've been looking towards the future. But of course, you know, you can find some useful pointers to the future in the past. And the reason we're going back in time to Paris is we're going to meet key psychogeography characters and a group called the Situationists. We'll look at some of their ideas about urbanism and the consumer society, and they're surprisingly relevant today. Then I'm going to turn to contemporary psychogeography. Now, I'm very lucky, I'm really lucky in my work as I visit cities all around the world to meet architects, to look at projects, go to events, etc. Here I am in Cracow, fantastic. And I always try to stay some extra time so that I can explore the city by walking it. I love doing that. I'll ask, when I look at contemporary psychogeography, can you actually design psychogeography? Next, I'm going to go and look at the digital world and how deeply it is embedded in our cities, and especially what we do in our cities. I'll call this digital world the digital matrix. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines matrix as the cultural, social, or political environment in which something develops. And boy, something big has developed in the digital that is cultural, social, and political. And oh yeah, the reference to that 1999 film, some of you might have seen, with Keanu Reeves, The Matrix, you know, where the one where he discovers that everything is a big simulation, that's not an accident. I'll offer some big warning signs about the digital matrix. Now here, let me just get my pointer. Here is some of the existential threats facing humanity. And I won't explain them all. Some of them you'll know very clearly. Environmental catastrophe, pandemic as if there's a disease that erupts and wipes us out that we can't cure in time. Cosmic event could be an asteroid impact or a nearby gamma ray source. The last one I put on my list is the hostile singularity. That's why it's in red. And we'll come back to that. And finally, if there's time, I hope there's time, because this is the important message, I'll offer something that psychogeography reveals in a place where it's already tomorrow. And of course, that's China. Strangely, and quite surprisingly, it gives suggestions about a post-digital sort of psychogeography. Okay. Psychogeography is all about reading your environment by walking through it without a plan. It's a psychological geography that's based on observation, emotional reaction, observing people and the built environment, and making spontaneous decisions about where to walk. And the idea of psychogeography, as we understand it now, came from Paris. Now this is the first, where's my pointer? Here we go. This is the first ever photograph taken of a city, and it was in 1839, and it's Paris. Strange enough, we don't know the date, but we know that it was taken at 8 o'clock. And one of the curious things about it is that the street seems deserted, but there are two people here. There's one guy who's having his shoes shined, and that's the shoe shiner there. And the reason we can only see two people is, of course, because Louis Daguerre had to have a very long exposure. So in fact, that was probably a busy street. Now, in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution and rapid urbanization were making cities so big, and they were transforming them so fast, that it was impossible for one person to know everything in it. Walking the city became an adventure of discovery. And in Paris, as I'm sure many of you know, Haussmann carved up the city with great boulevards, opening vast walking corridors. They cut through neighborhoods, and they mixed up the classes. This is Charles Baudelaire. In French, a flâneur is someone who walks around the city with no particular agenda, and the Bohemian poet Charles Baudelaire was the quintessential flâneur. He was an actor in the theater of the street, but simultaneously detached from the street. In a book of poems he wrote, which was actually published after his death, called Paris Spleen, he wrote, "What strange phenomena we find in a great city. All we need do is stroll about with our eyes open. Life swarms with innocent monsters." Now, let's fast forward to 1953. This is even, this is a difficult word for an English fellow to pronounce, Steglov. He was actually a Parisian, and he wrote under the name of Gilles Yvain. And he wrote a fantastic essay called Formulary for a New Urbanism. And he starts by saying, "We are bored with the city." He says materialism has made leisure empty. And so he described an imaginary city where, and I quote, "the districts could correspond to the whole spectrum of diverse feelings that one encounters by chance in everyday life." Diverse feelings. He's talking about a city defined by diverse feelings. And he lists his quarters in this essay. They're called, for example, I just list a few of them because there's about 20 or 25, Bizarre Quarter, Happy Quarter, Noble and Tragic Quarter, Historical Quarter, Sinister Quarter, etc. So we now have an urbanist proposition, almost an urbanist plan, where emotions, feelings, map out the blueprint. Furthermore, Steglov proposes that all the citizens of his city spend their time in a state of drift, of dérive. Now, Steglov's essay had a big influence on the Lettriste Internationale, a group who rejected functionalist urbanism. Even so, even though he was a member of these people, the Lettriste Internationale, they expelled Steglov in 1954. He was a bit mad. In fact, later on, in 1959, he tried to blow up the Eiffel Tower. And the reason he did that was because lights from the top of the Eiffel Tower were shining through his attic window and disturbing his sleep. So, who were these lettrists? Now, the history of Paris avant-garde artists and political radicals. It's really complex. Groups are constantly forming, fracturing, personalities are clashing, doctrines are adapted and rejected. But I'll just tell you quickly about the Lettres Internationales because it's relevant to this whole urbanist drift that we've started on. The Lettres Internationales formed because of the Dada-inspired lettristes, but the lettristes were not radical enough. So the Lettres Internationales were a breakaway. And they did actions like, for example, they declared that God is dead at a service in Notre Dame. Now, remember this. Declaring God is dead in Notre Dame is a constructed situation to disrupt an establishment institution. We now move on to our third and most important of the three historical characters I want to talk about, Guy Debord. Now, he was a founding member of the Lettristes. In 1955, he published the theory of the dérive. And it was him who gave us a definition of the dérive. He said it was an experimental exercise where a person or a group of people have to drop everything that they're doing and just go wandering in the city. And their path through the city is guided by, and I quote, the attractions of the terrain and the encounters they find there. So he says it's not a matter of chance, but it's guided by the psychogeographical contours of the city. And as for psychogeography itself, here we have the definition that he offers, and this is the first definition of psychogeography. It's the study of the precise laws and specific effects of the geographical environment, consciously organized or not, on the emotions and behavior of individuals. Again, emotions. Now, frankly, there's a lot that's dodgy about Debord's ideas. He says psychogeography is scientific with precise laws, but clearly it's not. It's subjective and it's difficult to quantify. It's not scientific. And Debord's own Paris dérive, they were usually drunken get-togethers with his political pals, and they went from bar to bar getting pissed. It's similar to what we in the UK call a pub crawl. But they didn't even get very far. Now, here is a psychogeographical map of Paris that he published. And these, it really covers not a very large area. He was mainly around Saint-Germain. The river flows through here. That's the island with Notre Dame in it. Went up into Les Halles a bit. So this was Guy Debord's dérives. But the big thing is that setting out a subjective emotional dimension to our interaction with the urban environment, I think that sounds pretty good. It's also very analog. It's not digital at all. Debord made a new grouping in 1957, and this is key. It was called the Situationiste International. The first situationist bulletin, published in 1958, included Steglov's urbanist essay, you know, where he lays out a kind of emotional urban plan. And weirdly, this is really weird for us in the 21st century, every page virtually, or every double-page spread, had a picture of a young woman. Why? Didn't relate to the text at all. But there you go. As time went on, Debord moved the situationists on from concerns about art and psychogeography and focused on a more anarchist Marxist agenda. And in 1967, he published the seminal work, The Society of the Spectacle. Now, the message was that capitalist society had replaced authenticity with representations of commodities, delivered through propaganda and advertising. the state was an active player in the process. He was a Marxist, but he was no friend of the Soviet Union. He saw them as part of the spectacle as well. What de Bourgh is saying is that we are all slaves to the spectacle. And that's the same as saying we are slaves to the system. Now, ask yourself, does a system that replaces everything authentic with a representation sound familiar to us today? Nowadays, it's estimated that Americans see 3,000 to 5,000 brand images a day, more and more of them delivered digitally, of course. And unlike 50 years ago, the digital world delivers images targeted to the individual. When de Bourgh says the spectacle itself is actually, and I quote, a social relation among people mediated by images, it even sounds a bit like social media. The Situationists were all about the situation. What is the situation? Now, this was originally defined as, and I quote, this is the last quote from Guy Debord, you'll probably be relieved to hear, a moment of life concretely or deliberately constructed by a collective organization of a unitary ambience and a game of events. Well, what does that mean? Whatever it means, the situation became politically provocative. He's saying it's a constructed situation. You arrange things so there's a situation that makes something happen, exactly like the lettrists when they declared God was dead at Notre Dame. But de Bourgh really wanted to force revolution, to break the spectacle. When the Situationists found an opportunity, they constructed the situations. Their first moves were setting up an anarchist appreciation society at the University of Strasbourg in France and publishing a pamphlet attacking the university. That got the student union banned. That got them national press, and then they had a national voice. And by this time, it's 1968, and the Situationists played at least some part in the French civil uprising in May 1968. And that was when Paris took en masse to the streets, but not like flaneurs or psychogeographers with no agenda. They were there to challenge the system. It was the closest Western Europe came to a 20th century revolution. Before we move on from Paris, what are the takeaways from all this? What are the lessons? Okay, urbanism, first of all, is about more than the built environment. It's about the people on the street. When you're a flaneur walking along, you're observing people as well as the built environment. And to read the city, you should take to the streets. Go out into the city. Walk it. Steglov taught us that you should seek an authentic, emotion-based urbanism. And finally, and I know this is a little bit dodgy because it refers to street protest, and street protest has been hijacked, I feel, recently to a large extent by people like nationalists and the alt-right and some pretty nasty people. But protest is also the territory of progressives. So I think the fourth takeaway is to confront the spectacle or the system, construct a situation. And that could mean taking to the streets. Okay, let's jump to the 21st century. Lots of things have happened since the Situationists and their psychogeography. There's an urban renaissance underway after the modernist decades when planners prioritized cars over people and obliterated so much territory for highways and endlessly repeating Plattenbau social housing. Nowadays, city centers are not just offices and car parks, dead at night apart from some dispossessed souls. They've been regenerated. They're mixed use, connected and alive at the end of the day. And big cities are densifying. The exodus to the suburbs is in reverse. Pedestrians and cyclists are reclaiming territory from the car, and the car is no friend of the city. So as we began to get more public realm and more street activity from pedestrians and cyclists, sure enough, in the first decade of this century, psychogeography came back. because psychogeography, of course, is about walking. It's not about driving. And it became trendy. And we had books like these, which became bestsellers and the kind of things talked about at intellectual dinner parties. Now, there's a familiar cycle that seems to make some parts of the city especially rich psychogeographical territory. Disused industrial premises or edgy old inner city slums offer low or no rent situations that attract creative people. Squatters and bohemians are followed by hipster businesses like galleries, cafes and bars, and gentrification is underway. In London, I've recognized guys who once served me some cheap Vietnamese food in really shabby cafes, and years later they're serving the same food, but now they're in an artisan food market full of millennials. It's called street food, and the price has jumped by 4 or 5 times. Then the developers arrive. They want in on the new marketability of the location. They build, and the old cityscape gets immersed in a new one. The extreme example of this is the High Line in New York. Designed as a linear park, I'm sure a lot of you know, along a disused railway line in New York City, in Manhattan, which ran through an area of post-industrial abandonment around an area called the Meatpacking District, actually. Now, one of the main architects was this lady here, Liz Diller, and I interviewed her in 2012, just before it opened, or just about the time it opened. Actually, I can't remember now. That was about the time it opened anyway. And she talked about what the High Line would reveal to people who walked along it. She talked about the blind side of buildings and pockmarks, empty spaces. There was a melancholia, she says. Now, her urban intervention has inspired schemes all over the world. So many cities want to build their own High Line or something similar. And it's worth noting that because it's designed to walk along and to look at things from, it's, in a way, a design for a 21st century flaneur. And, oh, hold on, sorry, we've got to go back. Oh my God. All right. Yeah, here we are. When you look at the route up there, you can even see it meanders a bit. So it's a bit of a drift. So, as I say, it's for the 21st century flaneur, or at least tourists and day trippers who are the contemporary mass variation on flaneurs. And there's a lot I could say about that, actually. But unfortunately, there's not time. We've got to keep things on the move. Oh, my God. When the High Line used to look like this. Now, when I walked it in 2016, it looked like this. And this is from the same spot. If you look closely, you can even recognize that particular building. And of course, these huge skyscrapers are coming up. And all of these buildings have been restored, and new ones put in all the gaps. So it's completely transformed. What does that mean for the psychogeography? Now, psychogeography has always been about observing people in the city. Nowadays, the people you observe, they don't even need to be on the street. We're still stuck architecturally in a time that I call big glass. Everything's got to be glass. Oh, bollocks. Yeah, there we go. Like those skyscrapers. And something that you get on the High Line is a lot of apartments and hotels which you can look into. So, of course, the people inside, they need to display trendy, tasteful lifestyle choices in their furniture or their ornaments. The rooms are almost like a shop window. But there's more. On the street, a flaneur observes people in public life, but now they can observe people in their private lives. So the flaneur becomes a voyeur. And on the High Line, the Standard Hotel has a reputation for exhibitionists and sex acts performed against a glass window. And here's the fellow revealing his equipment. I say, great. If people want to show off, let them do it. No one's hurt, and some are thrilled. It's an electric thread in the emotional weave of psychogeography. And it brings us back to Steglov's Urbanism. Remember how he proposed quarters based on emotion? Well, how about a lust quarter? Oh, hold on, we have that already. They're called red light districts. Areas such as Soho in London were places for free spirits. They came to dispel the drab world around. They wanted to drink. They dived into conversations with strangers or performances in clubs. Or, of course, they even dipped into sex and sleaze. Now, such places arise organically. They are fascinating psychogeography, but they're melting away. They're melting away for lots of reasons. Gentrification, because we live in perhaps more morally conservative times, and not least, of course, because people traffickers have made sex workers into victims. It's contemporary slavery. No one wants that. But it does bring up the question, can you design psychogeography? Architects and planners design the built environment, which provides the physical frame of psychogeography. So the answer is yes. But the worlds they've made have often been divorced from people. And this was mentioned in an earlier talk about, which I feel very much about modernism. The contribution of actual physical humans becomes almost irrelevant to the visual ideals of, say, Corbusian social housing or Miesian glass towers. It was Susanna who mentioned that you have these beautiful architectural photographs and there's no one in them at all. So modernism with its banal built environment could be rubbish for the flaneur. Not much fun at all. And so often, the emotion generated was alienation. Flaneurs would often find themselves diverted into underpass tunnels to cross boulevards that had become highways, or onto elevated walkways where traffic was the main thing to watch. Nowadays, architecture luckily tries to contribute a more organic streetscape. It's a bit more mindful of the pedestrian. There's greenery back on the street. It place-makes, yet never quite finds a bohemian edge. And as for designing a location for illicit pleasures, architects have not got a clue. All right. Oh, I don't know why it keeps jumping. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm coming to the right place. Can designers learn how to reconnect to the psychogeography of the emotional city? Well, I'm going to quickly look at two areas that give clues that maybe they could. And those two areas are cinema and China. All right, here are four classic films. I'll list them here. To save time, I won't read them all out. But obviously, romance there. I love Himmel über Berlin, by the way. It's a great Wim Wenders film. And it's when Berlin really was poor, but sexy. Now it's built up, of course. So the point about all that is that cinematographers understand the relationship between city and emotions. They understand that a city can become a character in the script. And these are examples of that. I think that cinema should be part of every architect's training. I think architects need to become, in part, cinematographers, because they're creating the sets for drama, and that drama is city life. Fine, you say, but has cinema ever inspired any urbanism in the real world that we could take a derive through? Well, I think it has, and I think the classic example is Sid Mead. He's a Pasadena-based artist, and he did the concept designs for the original Blade Runner. Incidentally, for the new Blade Runner as well. But he did the original Blade Runner back in the early 1980s. And obviously, you know, it's moody, neon-infused, jazzy city, and there's this backdrop of unfeasibly tall towers, dynamic advertising, And it's a pastiche of older urbanisms. It's New York meets Tokyo, and it's the Los Angeles of film noir. Who'd think that 3 speakers use the word noir in one day? But this vision, the vision that Sid Mead drew in the early 80s, it's drenched with psychogeographical possibilities, and we find it emerging in countless Asian cities. Okay, you're probably asking, when's he going to talk about the digital? What is psychogeography in the digital world? Well, since 2007, we've had Google Street View. We can wander the streets of most cities, not China actually. Google is banned in China. Now, when I book a hotel, I often approach it in advance on Street View just so I know my way from the station, see what it's like. And the street never looks exactly the same. You know, the weather's different, the lighting is different. Sometimes a building has gone, a new one's appeared. But effectively, I've got a virtual facsimile of the urban world at my fingertips. And I admit it, I have taken virtual derives through cities I have never visited just on Google Street View. But out in the real world, a derive, a psychogeographical drift itself has tried to go digital with some apps. And it was around about 2010 that they started first appearing, when psychogeography became fashionable again. And we had Serendipiter, suggests routes according to random instructions. I like this one a lot. Turn left and then follow a cloud. If there are no clouds, make one. And it's very Yoko Ono, that. Another app, Derive, does pretty much the same thing. It's got some nice drawings. And then there's this one, Drift. But, of course, these may be fun, but it's not a real derive. It's not real psychogeography, because in the real stuff, you're guided by the city, not by an algorithm. Well, what's coming to your phone now is augmented reality, or AR. Remember the Pokemon Go craze of 2016? This is a street in Warsaw, by the way. The game put characters out in the real world via your smartphone. So it's an example of AR, where we overlay the real world with extra stuff. Now, initially, it looked like wearable technology, like Google Glass, Snap Spectacles, that kind of thing. That would be the next big thing, and they'd have loads of AR, and it would become an everyday experience. But they didn't take off because of privacy issues. Maybe they'll be back. I don't know. But we're getting more and more AR through our mobiles. Yeah, I just wanted to get the fox moving there on the Google one. Some of it is it's the kind of stuff I like. You know, there's an app. The next time I go to New York, I don't know when that will be, I know there's an app where you point your phone at a building, historic skyscraper, probably a new one as well, and it will tell you all the details, the dates, the characters, stories about that building. Well, that's the kind of app I want, and that's a very psychogeographical app. But of course, AR is a marketing tool as well, as this example shows, and this is the only example I've got, sadly, which is for the driver and not for the walker. But it's obviously an area that advertising would move into. Okay, if AR builds more and more layers of overlay onto the real world, it will obscure it, it will overwhelm it. Now, London-based designer Keiichi Matsu did a fantastic film, which you can dig around and find on the internet. I think he's taken it off his own site, but it's still out there. And it was to demonstrate his hyperreality concept. And in this world that he created, all of this AR stuff overwhelms the character to such an extent that she loses her identity. Anyway, We're now only a step away from dropping the real world completely for the virtual city. And we're getting pretty close there in video games. All of these things are literally just a diversion from what's really happening in the city in the digital age, however. It's not just about seeing the city. It's about everything we do in the city. Digital has become ubiquitous. And I want to talk about the social dimension. We interact, this is stuff we'll all know, but let me just spell it out. We interact with the city and each other via digital media. We arrange social events on Facebook. Mainly we just track friends through the screen. We choose a date through an app like Tinder or Grindr. Then we have online city guides to suggest a bar or restaurant to meet them. They give us a curated choice that sorts and ranks the suggestions. If we're eating at home, we can order online and the food is delivered, just like other commodities. Yes, this is the age of the shopping center and the hipster high street, but retail is dying because in between them, the internet has become the shop. And wherever we are, we don't even need cash anymore because the payment's gone electronic as well. In fact, we don't even need to go out. As far back as 2003, the Japanese Health Ministry defined hikikomori, the syndrome of young people who just isolated themselves in their room completely. They didn't want to come out anymore. Hikikomori has since gone international. Digital makes it easy. The virtual city will make it easier. The city has always been where people have come together to trade and consume, where they meet, where ideas are exchanged. All of these things have gone digital. Is the digital matrix itself the new city? Now, we're generating streams of big data, and the companies are collecting and processing the data to influence our choices. And if we look at the biggest companies in the world, this is what we find. Now, these are the biggest companies in the world by market capitalization in March of this year. Market capitalization means how much these companies are worth on the stock market. I'll just explain. Now, the ones with the, there's some names that may not be so familiar, so I'll tell you. In number 2 slot, Alphabet. That's the holding company of Google. Tencent, it's a Chinese company. They do online services and artificial intelligence, or AI, amongst other things. Who are Alibaba? It's another Chinese company, even more into the internet and AI. 7 of the top 10 companies by market capitalization are digital, and they're the ones with the red arrows. They are part of the bedrock, a very huge part of the bedrock of the digital matrix. Now, Guy Debord's spectacle was about capitalism. At the very least, the digital matrix is the mediator of the contemporary spectacle. That's what I say. We may appear to be on a derive with the digital matrix. In reality, we're sleepwalking deeper and deeper into it. But I don't want to get too far from the city streets. Now consider some other sorts of big data that we're generating if we're on a derive or stepping out for any other reason. In the city, we're under surveillance by CCTV. The city I come from, London, we have, it's incredible, 500,000 closed-circuit television cameras watching us in the streets. And there's some other statistics there, the money spent, and in a single day, an average London person like me would probably appear 300 times on CCTV. So we've got a lot. Now, what happens when that CCTV feed is married to face recognition technology, vehicle identification, etc., and a database of citizens? Some Chinese cities are already doing this, and some of you may have heard of a system called social credit. which allocates everyone a social credit rating that can even be affected by behavior such as smoking on the metro, probably deserves that, no one should smoke on the metro, or buying too many video games. If your credit goes low enough, you could be blocked from buying, say, a train ticket or a plane ticket. So let's look at this clip from CBS News about Beijing, 30 seconds or so.
It can recognize more than 4,000 vehicles.
Chinese technology firms such as SenseTime are helping the government effort by developing advanced cameras that use artificial intelligence to track just about everything.
This knows every person, every bike, every car, every bus that goes through the frame.
You can tell whether it is an adult, a child, a male or female.
Police in Beijing have been wearing these glasses that can recognize faces linked to the government's national database to help boost arrests.
Okay, it's time to tell you about the singularity. It's all about artificial intelligence. We all know AI is getting better and better all the time. It drives the digital matrix, and it's inspired endless science fiction. Now, a brilliant mathematician, one of the most brilliant mathematicians of the 20th century was John von Neumann. Not necessarily a nice guy. He wanted to have atom bombs dropped on the Soviet Union, and he worked on the Manhattan Project, which built America's atom bomb. But he was interested in many things, including ideas about self-replicating machines. The last thing he was working on in 1957, when he died, was to reveal parallels between the brain and the computer. But before that, he said, and I quote, "The ever-accelerating progress of technology gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race, the human race, beyond which human affairs as we know them could not continue." This spells out that at some point, artificial intelligence could cross and exceed human intelligence. And opinions divided about that. Some experts say it's close. Some say, I keep hearing 30 years, probably I'd average 30 years at some of the estimates of when the singularity happens. Some say next century and some say never. But I can imagine a situation where one of those 7 big technical big boy companies, or maybe even a tech startup, maybe someone in Eindhoven, could engineer AI to take over its decision making, perhaps initially to participate in the board meetings, as it were, that make decisions for the company. The objective would be that to get better decisions, and the decisions would be about increasing your market share in the digital matrix. Now, if the AI is programmed that way, it may conclude that the fastest way it could achieve that objective is to make itself even smarter than it already is, or make a replica of itself that is improved and smarter. Now, what would our purpose be as human beings if we were no longer top dog? Merely to play around? Satisfy our desires like dogs? What would a superior intelligence do with humanity? We can be a nuisance. We can scream for attention. We can disrupt. We can break things, just like small children. It might be best to get rid of us, as if we were pests. On the other hand, anyone with a small child will know that, 1, you should never leave them alone out of your sight. That's surveillance. 2, all you have to do is sit them in front of a Walt Disney cartoon to keep them absorbed and quiet for a bit. The digital matrix is halfway to delivering the Disney cartoon that never ends. After the singularity, all of us could be immersed in it forever. All right, We're now going on to post-digital. Just got to get my pages in the right order. Ah, here we are. Okay. Thanks for your patience. Let's return to China. Oh my God, I'm over time. Well, I'll go through this real quick. I'm looking for different non-digital pointers to the future. Let me tell you about the first morning I woke up in Shenzhen. It's the first time I visited China. It was the year 2011. Now, this megacity of Shenzhen is the key to contemporary Chinese urbanism. It was the original boomtown, I'm sure many of you know this, created out of mere villages by the economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s. It hasn't stopped booming ever since. Virtually anything futuristic you see in any Chinese city, Shenzhen was there first. Just last week we heard about that DNA-designed engineered baby, or babies, can't remember, but they were from Shenzhen. This was the view when I woke up on the first morning outside my hotel in Luohu. Now, this line of futuristic skyscrapers, it was materializing out of a morning mist, and crowds of people were surging out of their new super shiny metro system. They were dressed smartly and they were heading to offices. I could hear a strange language in announcements drifting across the plaza, or snatches of people talking on their phones. I felt exhilarated, as if I had woken after many years into a future world, alien yet strangely familiar. I started on a long derive, a long psychogeographical exploration. I headed along a great boulevard. Picture number one is actually that morning where these skyscrapers were materializing out of the mist. I headed along a great boulevard, and where's number two? Number two, here we go. At that big skyscraper there, which is in an area called Huashang, I turned into a side street. There hadn't been many people on the boulevard that I'd walked along, but on the side street it was really, really busy. And I found an informal market where people were trading tiny components from waste electronics which were piled on the ground. And that's photograph number 3. Sorry, it's a bit dark, but there's piles of electronic junk there, and people are trading them. The market's gone now. I walked out of the electronic zone, and I passed some company workers, and they were doing morning exercise to some music. Here they are, number 4. And then where did I go? I dived into this local neighborhood, which was full of colorful market traders. And I stopped. I was hungry by this point. This is a big walk, by the way. You know, a kilometer is about this on this map. So I was hungry, and you're in an area where not one word of English is understood by virtually anyone. So I had to just pick some food that looked like vegetables that I eat. And it was fantastic. I had a lovely meal. Then, that's 6. Where's 7? Where's 7? Oh yeah, 7. I discover a great park, and I cross it. And then I come into Futian, which is a new and even bigger business quarter and more recent than Luohu, where I was staying. So the scale goes up again. And then finally I'm at the Civic Center, where there was some art installation. And that was a really good psychogeographical exploration. It was entirely chosen by my emotional response, my feelings about the environment I've been walking through. Now, I've been to Shenzhen a few times since. With this derive, the skyscrapers were thrilling, yes, but as in Blade Runner, I found that the vibrancy of the city was on the ground. Where the activity was, it was like that electronics junk market or the local neighborhood, mainly interstitial spaces, nooks and crannies in the urban fabric. Even the company morning exercise was between a bus stop and the building. A year ago, I interviewed Meng Yan, this guy here of Shenzhen-based architects Urbanism. and they created an urbanist biennale in Shenzhen. Their theme was urban villages, the little neighborhoods, sometimes hundreds of years old, hidden behind the boulevards and skyscrapers, places where developers had not collected lots of little plots to make a big site for a mega project with a big footprint. The urban villages of Shenzhen were built up rapidly and haphazardly during the Deng Xiaoping era. They got overcrowded and dirty, they became slums, they became crime spots. The city and the developers started obliterating them, but the ones that survive are now thriving. They're even gentrifying. And this is what Meng Yan told me. He said, the urban village reveals an alternative model of urban development which is self-sponsored, self-motivated, and diverse. So, should architects keep out of the urban village? No. Urbanis went into a Shenzhen village called Nantou, and they worked with the locals. They brought art into the place. They restored historic buildings. They built a community center and a library in a new public space they cleared in the heart of it, and that's what you see in that photo. So I'm going to quickly show you 4 different urban villages in photographs I took myself, not all in Shenzhen, in 4 different places. And I'll just show you very, very quickly. This is a residential district in Guangzhou, and it's so green. It's lovely. It's full of plants. These are the hutongs of Beijing, or some of the hutongs. Dense, full of artisan workshops, but gentrifying, but the artisans are still there. Most side streets in Shenzhen where the urban villages survive look like this, and this one's full of eateries, very, very human-scaled. And if you stop at one of those restaurants, you probably have some good food as well, which I did. And finally, this is one of my favorite shots, Changsha, a city in the interior of China. And this is a night market in the very heart of Changsha. What lessons has my psychogeography revealed from China? This is the second last slide. You'll be relieved to hear. First, urban life exists on a human scale. Secondly, places thrive where planners have not planned. So, cherish the urban village. Cherish the urban village. Try to make that like, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Oh no, that's the next one. Let 1,000 small plots bloom. Instead of massing them all together for one big plot and building a shopping center and hotel residential complex. We have urban villages in every city in the world, from the Jewish quarter in Cracow to Dharavi in Mumbai, which has a population of 1 million, but it's an urban village nevertheless. They are all rich psychogeographical territory because they are organic, diverse, and alive. But the territory of the city is surrendering to corporations and mega developments, and we are all sleepwalking into the digital matrix. What is to be done? The situationists moved on from the derive to disruption, against the spectacle, against the system. I think we should start asking, should we follow in their footsteps? Thank you.